In the shadow of history's greatest conflict, an invisible army fought with paintbrushes instead of rifles, speakers instead of artillery, and imagination instead of brute force. This is the story of the men who never fired a shot, yet saved thousands of lives and helped secure Allied victory through the art of deception. By early 1944, World War II had raged across Europe for nearly 5 years. Hitler's forces had conquered much of the continent, constructing what they called the Atlantic Wall, a 2,400-mile network of bunkers, landmines, and artillery positions designed to repel any Allied invasion force. The Allies knew that to defeat Nazi Germany, they would need to establish a foothold in Europe, but a frontal assault against Hitler's Atlantic Wall seemed nearly impossible without suffering catastrophic casualties. When we look at what the Allies were facing, it's staggering. The Germans had deployed over 50 divisions along the coast of France. Any invasion point would be heavily defended, and Nazi intelligence was constantly watching for signs of Allied movement. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a brutal calculation: how to land over 150,000 troops on the beaches of Normandy without them being slaughtered before they could establish a beachhead. The answer would come in the form of deception, but on a scale never before attempted in military history. While operations like Bodyguard and Fortitude created grand strategic deceptions, another top secret unit would emerge with a different mission: to impersonate entire army units on the battlefield itself. Their name was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but history would remember them as the Ghost Army. In 1942, the U.S. Army began one of the most unusual recruitment drives of the war. They weren't looking for marksmen or mechanics. They wanted artists, actors, sound engineers, and set designers. The Army went to places like the Pratt Institute, Rhode Island School of Design, and even the advertising firms on Madison Avenue. They were essentially recruiting a creative team, people who could craft illusions. Among those recruited was Bill Blass, who would later become a famous fashion designer. There was Ellsworth Kelly, destined to be one of America's greatest abstract artists, and Arthur Singer, who would gain fame as a wildlife artist. But in 1944, these men had a different kind of artwork to create, one where the canvas was the battlefield itself. They told us we were artists going to war, but they wouldn't say what we'd be doing. It was all very hush-hush. All I knew was that I wouldn't be carrying a rifle, but my sketchbook might be just as important. The unit was officially designated as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but their mission was unlike any other in the military. They would become masters of 3 types of deception: visual, sonic, and radio. Together, these would create the illusion of troop strength where there was none. What made the Ghost Army unique was their comprehensive approach to deception. They didn't just create dummy tanks or play sounds, they crafted complete battlefield illusions that engaged multiple senses. They were essentially military method actors. The Ghost Army's visual deception was perhaps their most striking innovation. Using inflatable rubber tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces, they could create the appearance of an entire armored division in just a few hours. These weren't just simple balloons, they were sophisticated replicas designed to fool aerial reconnaissance. From 300 feet up, you couldn't tell the difference between a real Sherman tank and one of these inflatables. The rubber dummies were remarkable in their simplicity and effectiveness. Their real M4 Sherman tank weighed 35 tons and required a transport vehicle to move. The Ghost Army's inflatable version weighed about 100 pounds and could be carried by 4 men and inflated with air compressors in under 20 minutes. But visual deception was only one part of their arsenal. Perhaps even more remarkable was their use of sonic deception, literally the sounds of war played through powerful speakers. They recorded the sounds of tanks, trucks, and troops moving into position at Fort Knox. Then they mixed these recordings and played them through speakers that could be heard up to 15 miles away. It was essentially a military sound design studio. The Ghost Army traveled with a library of 300 sound effects recorded onto wire recorders, the precursor to tape recorders. At night, they would play these sound battles to convince German observers that massive troop movements were underway. Set up our speakers and play our tank noises all night long. Sometimes we'd even move the speakers slowly to create the impression of vehicles advancing. The Germans would radio back that an entire armored division was on the move. The third pillar of their deception was radio trickery. Special radio operators would impersonate their counterparts from the units they were mimicking, maintaining the same transmission patterns and operator quirks that German intelligence had come to recognize. This was method acting on the radio. Each real radio operator had their own style, what they called a fist, the particular way they tapped out Morse code. Ghost army operators studied these patterns and could replicate them perfectly. German radio intelligence would pick up these transmissions and believe they were tracking real units. But perhaps the most theatrical element of the Ghost Army was the special effects unit soldiers who would create the physical evidence of a massive military presence. They would go into towns wearing the shoulder patches of the units they were impersonating. They'd visit multiple cafes, spend money loudly, talk about their fictional commanders within earshot of locals. They knew some of these locals might be reporting to German intelligence. The deception extended to creating fake headquarters, with jeeps parked outside sporting the insignia of fictional generals. They even employed atmosphere, laundry hanging on lines, funny field kitchens, and vehicle tracks in the dirt, all designed to complete the illusion of thousands of troops where there were only hundreds. The Ghost Army skills would prove crucial in the most important Allied operation of the war, the D-Day invasion of Normandy. But first, they would play a supporting role in the grand deception known as Operation Fortitude. Operation Fortitude had two components. Fortitude North suggested an invasion of Norway, while Fortitude South implied that the main Allied thrust would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between England and France, not Normandy. The Ghost Army helped create the illusion of the fictional First United States Army Group, or FSG, supposedly led by General George Patton. This phantom army, positioned in southeast England, threatened to cross the Channel at its narrowest point, keeping German divisions fixed in position at Calais. The deception was multi-layered. Double agents fed false information to the Germans. Fake radio traffic suggested a massive buildup. Dummy landing craft were positioned where German reconnaissance planes could spot them, and the Ghost Army helped create the visual evidence on the ground. When the actual D-Day landings began on June 6, 1944, the Ghost Army remained in England, continuing to play their part in convincing the Germans that Normandy was just a diversion and that the real invasion would still come at Calais. The success of this deception cannot be overstated. For critical weeks after the Normandy landings, Hitler held powerful panzer divisions in reserve near Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. This gave the Allies precious time to establish their beachhead in Normandy. 2 weeks after D-Day, the Ghost Army themselves crossed the Channel into France. Now they would take their show directly to the front lines, where their deceptions would save countless American lives. Between June 1944 and March 1945, the Ghost Army conducted more than 20 deception operations across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. Each mission required them to impersonate a different unit, often much larger than their actual strength of just over 1,100 men. They typically impersonated units that were at least 10 times their size. In some operations, these 1,100 men successfully convinced German intelligence they were a force of 30,000 troops. One of their most successful operations took place near the Rhine River in March 1945. The Ghost Army impersonated two divisions, roughly 30,000 men, while the real division slipped away to cross the Rhine at another location. The 1,100 men of the Ghost Army held a 10-mile section of the front line that should have required 10 times that number. We were stretched so thin, it was terrifying. If the Germans had attacked in force, they would have run right through us. We were artists and designers, not combat infantry, but our rubber tanks and sound effects convinced them we were a massive force, and they kept their distance. Their operations required extraordinary attention to detail. They studied the units they were impersonating, learning their routines, communication patterns, even the way different units drove their vehicles or set up their camps. They understood that deception isn't just about the big picture, it's about the small details that make something believable. They were method actors living their roles 24 hours a day. The Ghost Army's operations often put them in real danger. They had to position themselves where enemy reconnaissance could observe them, making them vulnerable to artillery and air attacks. Several members were killed or wounded while creating their battlefield illusions. The paradox of their mission was that for the deception to work, they had to be seen. They couldn't hide in safety. They had to expose themselves to enemy observation, which meant exposing themselves to enemy fire. When the war ended in 1945, the Ghost Army's operations remained classified. The men who served in the unit were sworn to secrecy, unable to share their remarkable experiences even with their families. Coming home was strange. People would ask what I did in the war, and I couldn't tell them. How do you explain that you fought the Nazis with rubber tanks and sound effects? They wouldn't have believed me anyway. It wasn't until 1996, over 50 years after the end of World War II, that the Ghost Army's operations were finally declassified. Only then could these veterans share their extraordinary stories. When the full scope of the Ghost Army's operations was finally revealed, military historians were astonished. By conservative estimates, their deceptions saved thousands of American lives by drawing enemy attention away from vulnerable, real units. The Ghost Army's legacy extends far beyond World War II. Their innovative techniques laid the groundwork for modern military deception units and psychological operations. The fusion of art, technology, and psychology they pioneered would influence military thinking for generations. What makes the Ghost Army so fascinating is how they used creativity as a weapon. They showed that artists, designers, and creative thinkers bring unique and valuable skills to warfare that can be just as important as traditional military training. Many Ghost Army veterans returned to creative careers after the war. Bill Blass built his fashion empire. Ellsworth Kelly became one of America's most celebrated abstract artists. Art Kane became a renowned photographer who captured iconic images of jazz musicians and rock stars. In a way, their wartime experience was the ultimate creative challenge. They had created illusions where lives were at stake, and where success was measured not in aesthetic appreciation, but in enemy reactions. Returning to commercial art or design must have seemed straightforward by comparison. The story of the Ghost Army reminds us that war is fought not just with weapons but with minds. In the darkest days of World War II, when the future of democracy hung in the balance, America turned to its artists, designers, and creative thinkers to help turn the tide. For decades, these men couldn't speak of their contributions. Their battlefield masterpieces, the elaborate deceptions that saved countless lives, existed only in classified documents and in their memories. We recognize the Ghost Army as one of the most unusual and effective fighting units in military history, an army that conquered not through force, but through imagination.